fooled me once. Shame on you. It fooled me. We can't get fooled again.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 11 of Reframing the Narrative. Jake, good to see you again.
Good to be back, PJ. How's it going?
Going great, thank you. And we're going to kick off this week's episode with a little nostalgia and tie that into just reflections on life. And I think you've got some opening thoughts there, Jake, so why don't I hand it to you?
Well, all right, thanks. We are totally unscripted this week, so we'll be interested to see where this conversation flows, and hopefully everyone enjoys going along on the ride with us. So one thing I've been doing lately is a little bit of decluttering, and at the same time, I'm still thinking of that whole narrative theme that we're on, right? With this, the name of the podcast and the theme of the podcast, and how we're handed all these different narratives to buy into wholesale and whole cloth, or to kind of piece together, if not break apart on our own if we're discerning. So these things kind of tie together in funny ways. And in decluttering, I come across a lot of personal effects, and they take you back over the years, whether they're my personal effects or those from those of family members and loved ones, or letters received by myself or other loved ones. And sometimes reflecting on the contents or the nature of these things, you can't help but be transported back to that time and how you thought that you'd always feel a certain way, or you'd always be a certain way, always think a certain way. And that, of course, ties into these narratives. And you might always be a collector of a certain artist's records or something of that. And then you move on, and then you look back and you're like, oh man, I can't even listen to that music anymore. Or maybe you love it, but that's just part of that station that you were at that point in your life. But then what really struck me is the unfinished business, and maybe the ties that just never really came together. They remain loose, and the intentions that we may have at a certain time in our lives, and we never get around to doing certain things. We might just put something around, like literally on the other side of the bed, just because it's out of sight. And you say to yourself, you make a little Post-it note in your mind going, I'll get back to that one of these days. But I think at some point, at some level, when you do that, if you do put it behind the bed, you're saying to yourself, I can't get rid of this, and I'm not really going to get back to it. So therefore, I'm going to hide it behind the bed. And so at the end of the day, my most important takeaway is the intentionality of what we're doing at each point in our life. And you look back and you can sometimes feel like, wow, I was just so naive or innocent to think that my life would have gone in a certain way. But then upon reflection, you can often see, if you look closely, how these things still tie together, even though you have so many loose ends. And they all tie together in really fascinating ways. And that's one thing I've been integrating in a morning practice recently. I learned a practice that is no secret to anybody that's familiar with Tony Robbins. You can go on YouTube and look for priming, and it's just a practice. I won't even describe it here, but it involves some intentionality and some reflection on the past, some intentionality about the future and your present, and gratitude as well. And I love the message that he really stresses in a lot of his talks about another really important topic that we've touched on, which is fear. He likes to stress that you can't hold fear and gratitude at the same time. And so that's really become an important theme for me, just reflecting on all the things in the world that we could feel so fearful about. And, especially when you're kind of peeling that onion of the way the world really, we believe, we're finding out things aren't the way we're told. We look into these narratives and it can lead to a really dark place. But at the same time, when you do reflect on all these moments, and it might be opening a shoebox, it might be looking under the bed, it might be looking through a bunch of old letters, and you forgot even what those people looked like that wrote such passionate or impassioned letters to you, but they all tie together. They're all really moments that should still inspire you in your life. And you think back at all the fears. If we're staying on the topic of fear, you can think back on a lot of times when you did have these fears. Where are those fears now? And so I think what I'd like to say to anyone listening about fear is you can be encouraged by reflecting on your previous fears and asking yourself, are those still with you? Do they still have a hold over you? Like even things like Y2K or satanic panic or whatever it is. There are a lot of us who did believe in the climate change scam and hoax, right? There was so much doom and gloom about that. And a lot of us have woken up from that. So don't hold on to your fear, hold on to your gratitude. That's, I think that's really important. And it's very helpful for you to move forward, because it can be, and it is in many ways a dark world that can debilitate us from moving forward. But we need to live our lives and hold on to our gifts as well. So embrace those friends that you have now. Maybe they won't be important in the future, but they're important now, and they all tie together.
Well, that's really insightful, Jake, and thank you for that introduction. And there's so much to unpack with what you just described and your thought process there. It makes me think of a conversation I had with a former colleague a couple days ago, and we're just talking about the different experiences you have and how they make you, who you are. And even if they were negative at the time, you can look back and see how they built you to who you are today. And, even as you mentioned, the skills that you've got and experiences and, timely amongst all that, I just happened to have seen a really good sermon about Joseph, the story of Joseph in Genesis, and have been reading through that again myself. And, you think about someone who was sold off to slavery as a child and then went through many accusations, thrown in prison. Many things didn't go his way until, he persevered and ultimately was, made the second in command of all of Egypt, and, was then able to help his family during years of famine. And, there's many points in the story of Joseph where he could have given up or questioned what was happening to him that seemed unfair. And many years later, he finds himself as, one of the most powerful people in the known world at that time. And I think that, to your point about just being grateful for what you have now and how you can look back years later and realize that there was a plan behind everything, and it really has stitched together in ways that you never would have expected. I think that that's just a really timely reminder that I had. It's really helpful to put things into perspective a lot of times when you're, not on top of the mountain, you're somewhere beneath that, to just remind yourself that there's, down the road, there's something better, and that there, you will eventually get to the point where you look back and say, well, I went through that, but thank God, and I'm in a much better place now. So that's my initial reaction to kind of your train of thought there. But then there's so much that you said, like you were talking about even artists that you used to like, or music or whatever, and you look back and go, gosh, how did I think that was great? And even you and I were talking off air, and I know we've mentioned this in a previous podcast, but even I used to think the Beatles were one of the most brilliant bands ever, and that's sort of the narrative that we've been given since we were old enough to pay attention. And, just looking into some of the investigations by people like Sage of Quay and others, and, you realize that they were probably put on the stage and made to look as brilliant as they were. Their music was largely written for them in many circumstances, and you look at how many live performances of the actual Beatles exist, and they're slim to none, for obvious reasons once you start going down that rabbit hole. But, that's just an example. And I think I've also mentioned this recently, that I've even realized that some of the artists that I thought, let's say in my 20s, that I thought were brilliant and, cutting edge and all that. And then I go, oh, wait, they were put on the stage by the big club that neither of us are in. And you can see the evidence of that, right? And find pictures of some of those people giving the vow of silence or the hidden hand or what have you. But yeah, and just to kind of wrap up my initial train of thought, just, thinking about what's really important now may not be important in the future. And so many distractions in life that keep you away from the things you really want to do. I mean, I can't tell you, as someone who's a musician and has been for many years, when I tell people that that's been a passion of mine, people are like, oh, I always wished I could learn to play the guitar. And I look at them and say, well, you're not dead. Like, learn to play it, do it. Even in my own circumstance, I've played bass guitar for many years. And in the past few years, I've learned to, solo and play six string more properly. And that's just something I decided to do and make time. And it goes back to that idea of paying attention and where you're focusing the time that you do have, because you can do anything you want to do. It's just a matter of, willpower and making the time to do that. And so many people, as you say, put their items under the bed or behind the bed so that they can't be seen. And, one day they'll get to it. But in their heart of hearts, they know that they won't, and they're afraid to admit that.
Yeah, that's why they're not confronting it with full disclosure and honesty at that moment. And that's why it gets put aside, not front and center, but somewhere where it won't call attention to itself, is like, you're not dealing with this in this moment. And then it builds up. I mean, just in decluttering, I've been running across some ridiculous stuff that was put aside, and it's just been gathering dust, literally. But yeah, as far as like the Beatles and what we were handed goes, that's what we were told, right? That's the narrative that you had to venerate, if not worship. And that's a dirty word for me these days, but the Beatles, Lennon and McCartney. I mean, who's a better songwriting duo than Lennon and McCartney, right? Difford and Tilbrook in my book. Yeah, Lennon and McCartney, best ever, right? How can anyone question that? They never resonated with me. I trust my intuition so much. That's why I took this stage name, or named a podcast, known to podcast. Discerning Jake is so important to me. But on some level, I think we just know in our gut when things just don't ring true. And that whole Laurel Canyon scene, all of those bands that came out of that scene, that we at least believe, if not know, was very manufactured, and it had serious, very close intelligence ties based on the work of Dave McGowan and others about Laurel Canyon, and bands like Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, the Byrds, like that whole psychedelic scene, even Janis Joplin, the Doors, who I actually kind of like. They're the only ones that I like. But of that whole kind of a little bit dirty hippie kind of scene from that period, it was just foisted on us on FM radio for decades. And now we have like the oldie stations playing that kind of stuff. It never resonated with me. It's just left me empty. And there was something about it that I was like, why did that happen? And it just seemed like it turned on a dime. And you can see that with the Beatles as well. Like, why do you go from like 1965, a certain kind of, you're still in the same kind of twangy, I want to hold your hand. You can still hear that reverberating kind of in their music. And then you get to Revolver, and then boom, Sergeant Pepper. And it's like, this doesn't happen organically. You don't get these guys singing Love Me Do and I Want to Hold Your Hand. You don't get that organically without some help, and no pun intended. And yeah, I don't blame you for, thinking back to your 20s and saying, well, I was really into that band. It wasn't your fault. That's what you were given. And a lot of those things can be really good moments in our lives because sometimes they're actually legit good songs. One of my fondest memories was like the Violent Femmes was on the radio, and I was hurtling down the road in a rural countryside setting in the middle of winter, and our windows were down and we're all screaming Blister in the Sun, the lyrics to Blister in the Sun. That was handed to us as college radio at the time. That's what we were supposed to listen to. We were supposed to listen to Violent Femmes and the Smiths and REM. I don't know if that's manufactured, but those are good times. So roll with it.
To an extent, but I think we can look back and, with a little bit more age and wisdom, realize that many of those names that you just rattled off were definitely manufactured for us. And, even in my initial rabbit hole video in that sequence that I reorganized that came out of Attilian Child's The World's Secret Religion. But, there's a number of those faces in there that I put intentionally. And one of them is Michael Stipe doing the various gang signs, covered the All-Seeing Eye, and I think he's doing the Vow of Silence too. But, that being said, you kind of have to then go, well, why were they put there, and what narratives were they pushing on us? And, was it, climate change or whatever the topic du jour was? They were definitely part of pushing the agenda of the time. And I think even in the Beatles case and some of those other bands that I think were largely inspired by the Tavistock Institute, that you can look back at the family connections. You brought up the Doors, Jim Morrison, his father was, I think, a general
Rear Admiral
in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which we know was completely manufactured to start the Vietnam War. I believe the Grateful Dead, some of those folks had some connection to three-letter agencies and were largely, put on the stage almost immediately and made popular and promoted very heavily. So I think it's not an accident that, as you said, we went from the clean-cut Beatles to suddenly everyone was tripping acid and long hair and, against the man or the version of the man that we were given. You just have to look and really question what were these people put on the stage for, and, maybe take a closer look at their lyrics. And actually there's a quote from Jimi Hendrix, and I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember the exact quote, but he said something to the effect of, as a musician, you can hypnotize your audience and then insert whatever message you wanted them to receive. And that's a paraphrase of his quote, but you can find that online. So even he knew that, he was delivering a certain message, whether that was given to him or inspired or whatever the case may be. But he knew the power of music to influence people's thinking and influence societies. And I say that as someone who always loved Hendrix's music, but also, looking at how people get on the stage, which is never an accident. You just, again, have to use a little bit of discernment with all that. But I want to switch gears a little bit because you also brought up something that, in terms of using discernment and thinking about what's important or perhaps what's coming that will be given to us as important. You mentioned disclosure, and there has been a lot of discussion about disclosure lately, including the so-called JFK files. I personally have not gone through them, but I suspect that they're 90 pages of a nothing burger. I don't think anyone who could have been involved in that incident, if there was an incident, and that's another topic for discussion, but I don't think anyone new is going to be implicated. There's not going to be any real quote unquote justice come out of it. But it does seem like there is this slow drumbeat of disclosure happening for the people. Dr. Stephen Greer has been out there in the public space for a long time trying to say that, all these things, the secret space programs and, aliens have been in contact and the government is in regular conversations with them. I think all of these things probably are working together in ways that aren't totally apparent to me. But if I had to make an educated guess, I'd say it's priming people for some new savior to come and save mankind in some way. But that's just me spitballing a little bit. I've said a lot there. Jake, what are your thoughts on some of that?
Well, I'll hit on the kind of disclosure theme and thread in a second. I just going back to Hendrix and public rituals and performances. It came to my attention recently that Tool arranged their performances as a hypnotic ritual, and they admitted it as such. And so if you're out there to hypnotize, then what is your purpose? Because hypnosis and mass transformation, shall we say, emphasis on the trance is powerful. So to what end? And I think people, when you're going into a kind of situation, whether it's turning on the television that hits your brain waves at a certain frequency or whether you're going to a live performance, you should be equipped to defend yourself or exercise discernment or kind of snap yourself out of any kind of trance you find yourself getting into. And I remember when they basically ended terrestrial television, our friend, they're turning the frogs gay. He was correct. He said you can tune signals to entrance people. And there was a lot of research done on the hypnotic effects of television, how people go into a trance state after a few moments. Just it's like 30 seconds or 45 seconds. People are completely changed. And you can even observe that in yourself probably at some point. You're watching TV and someone says something to you and you have to snap out of it. It's like you go into this different state and you interact with people differently in the real world that are in the room with you. And so just be careful with that. But as far as like what we're being prepared for and disclosure and all this, good point on the JFK thing. I think it'll be just as big a nothing burger, if not bigger than the Epstein farce. It's pretty clear that Sheldon Adelson's widow funded Trump's campaign, and there are massive connections with the Mossad and certain intelligence ties with Epstein, the same ones with Epstein and probably JFK. I mean, Jack Ruby was heard to say certain things in jail about his motives for shooting the Patsy Oswald and about protecting his tribe. And there will be no disclosure of those ties when, the people that are bringing these to our attention, they go all the way back to Epstein Island, if not beyond that, to the 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s, and even earlier back to Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn being a very prominent, admitted and lauded mentor of Donald Trump. He of the McCarthy era, actually. He was the lawyer for McCarthy, right? And why bring attention to these things if they're a nothing burger? Because they're just trying to get us to pay our attention. And maybe there's something else going on at the same time that they're distracting us from. I did notice that, and I haven't watched it, but there is some kind of a documentary that purports to kind of blow the lid off of like the UFO and the alien agenda or whatever is going on. And they even get current Secretary of State Marco Rubio on camera saying there's so much that people don't know. And those of us in politics and, the movers and shakers, like we're privy to information. And if you only knew, there's a lot out there. And it seems like they're preparing some kind of narrative about people learning about those, like, well, we've got you, we told you about Epstein, we told you about JFK, now we're going to tell you about aliens. And at the same time, we did have 2 episodes ago, episode 9, we talked about the moon mission hoaxes, and now we're getting space is real again, right? I think a lot of people looking at things were like, you don't just hear every so often, you don't hear space is fake and gay. You hear that a lot these days if you're just out and about even, and not even behind in the shadows of the conspiracy world. You're hearing a lot of people doubt the moon missions, and you're even hearing people doubt the nature of our ability to get off this planet and out of the atmosphere, whatever it is. And now we're seeing, Elon is the big hero to the alt-right and the right through Trump and his association with Trump, and he's rescuing NASA astronauts, right? Like the big hero. At the same time, they're burning down Tesla dealerships all over the place. The poor guy, he's so betrodden. And so what's going on with that? I don't know where that's going.
Well, there, like many things, there could be the esoteric and the exoteric, and there could be intention that we may never fully understand. But what you made a comment about Tool, and I definitely grew up in the time where they were one of the biggest bands out there, and I must admit I've actually been to one of their shows many years ago, and if I reflect on what you were just describing, it probably is true. I mean, I can think it was definitely trance-like, and God only knows what sort of subliminal messages they were imparting into everyone who was there. But that being said, I was watching a recent podcast with JT and Brian from Demon Erasers, and I think it was Brian who mentioned it was a Prince quote or a Prince interview where he was talking to someone about like watching horror movies or something like that. And Prince had said, well, I don't watch movies. I don't, take any of that in. And the person was describing what he had seen. And he said, so it's part of you now, isn't it? And he's like, anything that you consume is part of you now. It's there permanently. I think these topics tie together well, that what you're consuming, be that music or entertainment, like you take that in and it absorbs into you. And that was truth that Prince was trying to convey in his later years. I think he realized what he was part of, and he was trying to slowly get some of those thoughts out to the general public that, very, very little of this is truly as innocent as we might be led to believe. Even television programming, they're telling you are being programmed. You are being given some sort of narrative to either consciously or subconsciously ingest and to become part of you. And I think that's a really important point for people to realize. I mean, not only just where you're paying attention and how you're spending your time, but anything you're consuming, whether that's on TV, whether that's, through YouTube or Spotify or whatever, except our show. Our show is a rare exception to that, of course. Keep tuning in. But no, in all seriousness, we really have to be deliberate with how we're spending our time. And by default, you're doing one thing, you're not doing other things. And that goes back to the decluttering idea that so many things we put off to the side to really, like, we'll get to that one day. We'll do that, just not today. And how many just not todays happen, and then we find ourselves thinking about a life we never lived or could have lived, and what we chose instead. And just something for people to reflect on a bit.
Excellent points, PJ. And the flip side of the things that you didn't get around to is that the things you did get around to are also part of you. And that's really it's come into clear focus for me behind my sunglasses. In the time I've spent doing this exercise of decluttering, because and also in the self-reflection, the morning exercises or practice that I've been doing, is these things all tie together. And so that really brings home the point to me, of making these experiences that you have in life more authentic for yourself. Make them yours rather than consuming them. And I think that's where we get in trouble a lot of the times is by consuming in lieu of authentic experiences. And the more things go towards AI and the less trustworthy these things are, I think maybe it's not even a secret that this is what we need to practice is authentic experiences. What can you even believe? Like, so many people are just, they'll look to these events that are broadcast over the television and the airwaves and now direct through whatever means, digital means, and they will literally say to the fakest footage you've ever seen, well, I saw it with my own eyes. It has to be real. And we're in an era where I think you pointed it out about the splashdown of this SpaceX rescue mission and how they went from cut to cut, and then that there were anomalies between cuts. And a lot of this stuff looks to me like it could easily just be literally AI generated. If you go to the just consumer level, the availability of these tools at the consumer level with the subscription to there are a number of AI generated video services. And personally, for myself, I use Adobe Premiere Pro. There is now in the latest version of Premiere Pro, if you have a sequence of a video and you drag it out, it can go and interpolate what happens next without even a prompt. You can say, like, a hand is going to grab an apple and pick it up, and your actual sequence that you shot with a camera can go to that point, but you can drag the timeline 5 seconds beyond that. And if you have enough before and during that motion, it will interpolate the next 5 seconds, and you can drag that out. The power of the tools that are making shit up, that could be presented as real, at the consumer level, that just paying for at the product level is already to the point that anything that you see that does not come from right before you really can't trust anymore. And I think we're about to confront an era of just complete distrust. And that's also why we're seeing these messages about, well, we can get back to space. Like, rah, we can do all these great things, because they want, there is this distrust, there's this cynicism, and the establishment really wants people to continue buying in. They emphasized reestablishing trust in government, for instance, and then I think they want to say reestablish and trust in an optimism for this AI agenda and where we're going. Trump, during his inauguration, he said, we're going to Mars. And Elon tweeted, Mars and beyond, or something like that. And he wears the Occupy Mars shirt and all this kind of stuff. And so we're heading towards an era of unknown as far as trust in anything. And then where does that lead us? What I would reassure people with is just, if you have gratitude for what is and what has been, and I don't want to sound like Kamala, but we don't have to be fearful if we have gratitude, because we can't hold gratitude and fear at the same time. And so don't let it lead you into just buying into things because it makes you feel numb or makes you feel assured. Just hold on to what's real, really, and tie those moments together, because that's what matters.
Yeah, I mean, so some really good points there. And in terms of the AI topic, it just really has hit me recently, both working on a new video, which I've determined will probably come out next week. But for Rabbit Hole viewers, I've got something as a little tide you over bit that I'll try to get out by the end of this week. But that being said, part of why I've delayed this project was doing this sort of research I would want to see as a viewer on the bug theory, as we talked about last week, and just showing people how much the emperor has no clothes in that respect. And even just, I was starting to timeline some things out and looking at Pasteur's most famous set of experiments were around rabies, but he's actually credited with developing remedies for cholera before that, and I didn't have anything at my fingertips to validate what went into that. And so I had a little conversation with ChatGPT, and ChatGPT will give you the glossed over rose-colored glasses version of everything. And I asked, yes, but was vivisection involved in these experiments? And ChatGPT said, yes, well, at the time, germ theory was still being proven, and it may have been involved on some level. And so I asked it, okay, so in these experiments with chickens, what exactly happened? How was this contagion extracted? And it kept glossing over things and not really giving me the answer. Whereas with rabies, we know it's well documented that there were a series of experiments that involved first dogs and mutilation of dogs and injecting things into their brains and then extracting fluids out of their brains and injecting them into the brains of monkeys, waiting for pus to be created, and then mixing that in a brew of chemical concoctions and calling that a solution or a remedy. And, I could not get that straight answer from ChatGPT about what was involved in the cholera experiments, because history has been, we all know that history is written by the so-called victors, or we might say the controllers, but it's just really become apparent to me that AI is on another level of rewriting history. In one sense, I was not able to get a straight answer from ChatGPT on the cholera set of experiments. But then I think about, too, in my experience being a new content creator and starting new channels to reach different audiences, I had recently started a TikTok channel and uploaded my initial set of videos, but the one that it would not let me upload, no matter how many times and edits I tried, was my video on 9/11. And I would have thought 24 years later, it was safe to talk about it on some level. However, the TikTok platform simply banned anything that I had to say about it, no matter how many segments I cut out trying to make it less controversial. It just was forbidden. And it makes me wonder, too, in both my long form video and the one specific to 9/11, there's some screen captures that I made of videos that I knew existed where, for example, you see the towers before the explosion and you see no approach of a plane. We all know of our generation who've looked into this, that those videos are real, that someone took that footage. But I think about years from now, the next generation or generation behind that, will they even believe what people were trying to say in our generation, that much of this was a big show on TV and much of what you saw was not real? Like, how will they even know what real is based on what AI does? And they could easily look, one might look at that video today and say, oh, well, someone just photoshopped out the plane. That's what we're looking at. And it gets to that point of, well, how do you even know what's real when you're seeing it on a screen? And I think that part of the answer there is discernment and looking at the bigger picture overall and the other pieces, how they fit together and what story they tell. But I think we're already at the point where you can look at any video and question its authenticity. And that's really scary to me for the future of what we know as history or alternative history. How does the next generation and beyond know what's true, and where do they find that, and how do you validate past videos or videos of the time? It's a really interesting problem, and I think we'll continue to grapple with that as the years progress.
Well, we know that anything that is disseminated on a mass scale also creates a mass consciousness. And if it's AI generated in a sense and disseminated, it's just this kind of ersatz faux consciousness that could also be manufactured. It's kind of a philosophical question of like, what is the intelligence that is behind the manufacturing of this kind of commonality of consciousness among people who witness what's on their screens. I won't say these events, But it also makes us wonder how much of what we've seen up to this point is manufactured. And I think we'd agree that a lot to most of it, if it's between if it's within that frame or the box, there's a good chance that it's deliberately, it's manufactured, it's planned, it's staged, it's at least very well managed. And I've worked in advertising in the past, and I know from experience that even a magazine ad with pictures, with graphics, with a photo or two, or whether it's a design element, and then ad copy, and then there's logos and everything, not a single element in even a print ad for a minor magazine, as long as it's a decent sized client that has some kind of a budget and someone in charge of their marketing, that will be looked over time and time again. It goes back and forth, and it's iterated and reiterated, and there's nothing that is left to chance with that kind of thing. It's questioned, it's thrown back to whoever the designer is or the copywriter, and then the whole team sees it again. And unless there's some really stupid people involved, you won't see any errors in there. And it's just, that brings me back to politics, where Teddy Roosevelt said, nothing in politics happens that's not deliberate. It's by accident, he said. And so if you take that to anything with a bigger audience than just a print ad in a magazine, and there's going to be even more eyes on it, and there's going to be even more care taken to bring it to where it's intended to go and be, and have the intended effect. Otherwise, that stuff gets canceled and you don't see it again. So there's the question of, where are we paying attention? And as we go forward, our attention will be necessarily drawn to things that really are generated by AI. And then we go back into kind of what the memory hole is. And as everything digital and online replaces the analog world and tangible things, I'm going through the decluttering of a lot of analog things at the moment. And you just wonder, what will the narrative be when you go to ChatGPT or the equivalent in a couple years, and there's no way to actually go back into archive.org or any digital type archiving mechanism or pool of information that we have, because it can just be messed with, and yesterday's news can be altered. And we even see that there was a big kerfuffle with Kindle, Amazon Kindle. When you buy a Kindle title, it says you are licensed to use this. It doesn't say you the owner of this content. And that gets into a whole bunch of things. They've gone in, and I think it was probably deliberate, but someone went in at one point and erased George Orwell's 1984 from everybody's Kindle just to prove a point, I think, at one point. So you could go back and you could rewrite War and Peace with AI and just sell that to everybody and say, yeah, that's what Tolstoy wrote, So we're entering a dangerous but also very interesting world. And I think the more things become manufactured and artificial, the more we will just have to be mindful of the real moments in our lives.
I agree. And I don't want to open too big of a can of worms as we're rounding the corner towards the hour mark. But, one thing is we're talking about AI, and I think I've mentioned this in one of our past episodes, but just thinking about the potential of a much bigger and more powerful AI that may have been with us in history for much longer than anyone realizes, that, whether or not you believe the Mandela effect, it does kind of seem like there has been something cobbling together history on some level. I mean, people who've looked into what's commonly known as Old World or Tartaria stories. Good example, the My Lunch Break channel on YouTube has done a lot of this documenting where you look at, who built this series of buildings or who was credited with, and often it's the same name or a variation of a name, and it's like there was some AI program coming up with a similar cover story for all these different structures, and when they were, decimated by a fire that was unexplainable, or in the case of the Chicago fire, supposedly a cow kicking over a lantern, some of these really less than credible stories, but they seem to have broad coverage for every major significant old world type of structure that exists. And it does make you wonder, has there been some sort of AI? And I don't know what that even looks like or how that works, but it's just a food for thought more that I want to throw out there. It's not just what we see online, but perhaps there's some other intelligence that is crafting a narrative behind the scenes, and only those who have cared to piece those together and look at them side by side are noticing that there's a lot of repetitiveness in the stories and the narratives for why those structures had to come down or were burned down or whatever the case may be.
And maybe part of it is just like we have a collective consciousness and it catches up to narratives, and then the edifice of these narratives sometimes just has to fall so that another reset is necessary, just basically because people are like, I'm onto you, bro. You just gave me 90 pages of Kennedy BS, and no, that's not what happened. Or Marilyn Monroe did not die from barbiturates, an overdose, or whatever the case. Epstein didn't kill himself. That'll stand by, which is 100% true, I'm sure. But maybe just it's like this cresting of consciousness and discernment. And it gets to a point where they're just like, okay, guys, we got to bring out the wrecking ball, and so we can stay in control of things, and we can be the gods, because that's what we're up against, is people who have designs to be the gods in this world. And as we know, they're mortal, and that's what makes them fear. And again, don't fear. I've been facing a lot of things related to mortality lately, and it's amazing how inspiring reflecting on that can be, because it really makes every moment more precious, and these things do tie together in very unusual ways, and they tend to work out, and we just need to find meaning in them.
Here. Well, this feels like the potential wrapping up point for this week's episode. I think a lot of these themes that we came into this conversation with have tied together well, and I don't really have much more to add to that. I think it just goes back to our usual message of, using discernment to whatever narratives are fed to you, and, especially as this ramps up in the golden age of 2025, definitely look at some of these things that are being put on the screen, whatever that screen may be, and give them another examination, or don't examine them at all, because they're probably just fake and a distraction for you. And there's probably better things you can be spending your time on. So any parting thoughts from your side, Jake?
Yeah, well, before we analog off, maybe our audience can point out some agendas that they see afoot, and we can examine together, because we're kind of sensing these things here in our little bubble, and it would be nice to hear from some people. And we do notice we're getting a little traction, especially on an alternate platform that isn't the main one, which is unusual and very encouraging as well. I've noticed that you're getting some traction with the Central Texas Rabbit Hole on what the platform formerly known as Twitter. How's that going?
Yeah, it's everything's stepwise, and I'm one guy trying to do this while juggling other life responsibilities. But I am seeing little bits of traction here and there, and that's encouraging. And I think as long as we keep doing what we're doing and trying to give our viewers something worth watching or listening to, then we're doing our job, and I think the rest will take care of itself. And, just second Jake on those of us who maybe heard a rumble in the distance and found us on the alternative platform. We love all y'all and hope you can continue tuning in and share with your friends. And yeah, just good stuff and more to come. And knock on wood, we might have a really special guest next week. We're going to try to have that discussion later today. But thanks, everyone, for tuning in this week, and we'll see you in the next one.
Take care, y'all.
You just have to flood a country's public square with enough raw sewage. You just have to raise enough questions, spread enough dirt, plant enough conspiracy theorizing that citizens no longer know what to believe.